Do you think about the last couple fights? Do you think about what happened, or have you processed it all? The end of the last fight against Amanda or Holly.
I think I'd just rather not talk about that right now.
Regardless of the sport, there is one thing that every professional athlete hopes to avoid. That thing is losing. This is especially true in the world of mixed martial arts. After all, 3 losses in a promotion like the UFC and a fighter can often find themselves looking for a new employer. Of course, even the best athletes lose on occasion. However, as we have seen, some come back stronger, while others never really seem to regain their form. So for this video, we'll be taking a look at a list of times in which a particular loss spelled the beginning of a massive downturn for a fighter's career. As always, if you guys enjoy this video, then please be sure to let me know by leaving a like and subscribing to our channel. Now without further ado, and ranked in no particular order, let's take a look at 10 fighters whose careers never recovered from a heartbreaking loss. Number 10. Johny Hendricks. The things that immediately come to mind when one reflects on the career of Johnny Big Rig Hendricks is the controversial loss to GSP, as well as his epic battles with ruthless Robbie Lawler. During the Lawler fights, Hendricks displayed the kind of heart and toughness that separates champions from the rest of the pack. Unfortunately, Big Rig was never quite the same after losing a close split decision and the welterweight title. Whether it was due to the damage absorbed during the battles with Lawler or the mental anguish over losing the title, it isn't entirely clear. Whatever the case, Hendricks would go on to lose 5 of his next 7 fights, suffering knockout losses to Stephen Thompson and Paulo Costa. To make matters worse, he also missed weight 3 times in that span. So in 2018, the struggling Oklahoma native finally decided to call it a career. Number 9. Chris Weidman. The All-American Chris Weidman will forever be known as the first man to beat Anderson Silva in the UFC. He is a former middleweight champion who also defeated legends like Lyoto Machida and Vitor Belfort. At the height of his career, the former Division I wrestler out of New York was considered to be one of the best pound-for-pound fighters in the world. However, following his first career loss to Luke Rockhold in December of 2015, Weidman has struggled to get back on track. Since losing the title to Rockhold, the All-American's chin has been questionable at best, and has also had a hard time staying healthy. The former champ has fought only 5 times since 2015, and has sadly been knocked out in 4 of those contests. Going from an undefeated world champion to losing 5 out of his next 6 fights definitely took many in the MMA community by surprise. However, despite his recent defeats, Weidman has insisted he'll continue fighting. Number 8. Luke Rockhold. Not too long ago, former UFC title holder Luke Rockhold was being hailed as one of the greatest talents to come out of the middleweight division. While Rockhold did manage to defeat Chris Weidman at UFC 194, in turn becoming the UFC middleweight champion, his career too has also taken a turn for the worse since that fateful night. In his very next fight, the California native would end up losing his title to Michael Bisping, a man who he had previously defeated, as the Englishman took down the American with a stunning first-round knockout. Following the Bisping fight, Rockhold would be on the receiving end of highlight reel knockouts in 2 of his next 3 contests. And now, with his most recent loss to Jan Blachowicz at UFC 239 this past July, the former middleweight king has been left contemplating retirement. Number 7. James Vick. James the Texecutioner Vick is a 6'3" fighter who has utilised his reach and impressive boxing skills to become one of the UFC's top lightweights. Following his 2018 victory over Francisco Trinaldo, Vick was sporting an impressive 13-1 record and appeared to be very close to earning a title shot. However, he ran into a roadblock in the form of Justin Gaethje. The 2 men headlined a fight night event that came to a dramatic conclusion when James Vick suffered a first-round KO loss. While this would be just the second knockout loss of Vick's career, it certainly wouldn't be the last. The Gaethje fight would mark the beginning of a 4-fight losing streak, in which Vick was also knocked out by Dan Hooker, as well as Nico Price. In a relatively short span, the Texas native has gone from a potential title contender to a man who will likely be fighting for his job the next time he steps into the octagon. Number 6. Chuck Liddell. Former light heavyweight champion Chuck Liddell is one of the biggest names in the sport of mixed martial arts. The UFC Hall of Famer defeated legends like Randy Couture, Vitor Belfort, Tito Ortiz and Kevin Randleman, all during his run as one of the biggest stars in the promotion. From April of 2004 to May of 2007, Liddell won 7 consecutive bouts in the UFC and established himself as one of the all-time great UFC light heavyweight champions. Of course, like all good things, winning streaks must come to an end. In this case, it was Quinton Rampage Jackson who put an end to Liddell's winning ways, doing so in spectacular fashion by knocking out the champ in just under 2 minutes. Sadly, both the Iceman's career and his chin would never fully recover. After suffering 4 consecutive knockouts, Liddell would retire for the second time in March of 2020. First after losing to Rich Franklin back at UFC 115, and finally after his trilogy match with Tito Ortiz in 2018, both of which saw him on the receiving end of a knockout defeat. Number 5. Ronda Rousey. Ronda Rousey was one of the most dominant champions the sport of mixed martial arts has ever seen. Over the course of her impressive 12-fight undefeated streak, only one opponent, who happened to be Miesha Tate, even made it out of the first round. Of course, her historic run came to a dramatic end, when Holly Holm landed a head kick that's been a mainstay on seemingly every single highlight reel since. No longer seen as invincible, Rousey would attempt to right the ship in her highly anticipated comeback fight. Unfortunately, her opponent would be the greatest female fighter of all time, in the form of Amanda Nunes. The two collided at UFC 207 back in 2016. In the end, it took Nunes just 48 seconds to dispatch Rousey, who now hasn't fought since. The initial loss to Holly Holm, followed by an unsuccessful comeback against Amanda Nunes, seemed to be enough to convince Rousey that this was time to part ways with the UFC. As of right now, Rousey has no plans to return and has constantly refused to address her losses inside the octagon. Number 4. Carlos Condit. The natural-born killer, better known as Carlos Condit, is a mixed martial artist who has earned a reputation as a no-nonsense action fighter that is rarely involved in boring fights. The former interim UFC welterweight champ has picked up 5 Fight of the Night awards, all since his promotional debut back in 2009. If someone was ever to write a book about particular fights that took years off an athlete's career, then Robbie Lawler vs Carlos Condit would likely be the cover photo. The two men went to war at UFC 195. With Lawler emerging the victor via a split decision. It was arguably Condit's most memorable outing, though it's fair to say that he hasn't looked the same fighter since. The Albuquerque native's post-UFC 195 record currently stands at 0-4, with his most recent loss coming against Michael Chiesa at UFC 232. While Condit is still a great competitor, his 4 consecutive losses would suggest that his many years of fighting have finally started to catch up with him. Number 3. Renan Barão. It wasn't all that long ago, around 2014, that the UFC was billing former bantamweight champ Renan Barão as one of the top pound-for-pound fighters in the world. At that point in time, the Brazilian was sporting an outstanding 32-1 record, and had just defeated Uriah Faber for the second time. However, his fortunes quickly changed once he faced TJ Dillashaw at UFC 173. After suffering an upset loss to Dillashaw that cost him the title, Barão's career took one of the most pronounced downturns in recent memory. The bantamweight standout would lose 7 of his next 9 fights. And to make matters worse, unlike other fighters on our list, Barão suffered defeat at the hands of several lesser-known mixed martial artists, before ultimately being released by the UFC in December of 2019. It was a massive fall from grace for someone who was once considered to be one of the greatest bantamweights in UFC history. Number 2. Anderson Silva. Anderson the Spider Silva is one of only a handful of mixed martial artists who is considered to be one of the greatest fighters of all time. The elusive striker held the middleweight title for over 7 years, and over the course of his reign, the Brazilian racked up victories over stars like Rich Franklin, Dan Henderson and Chael Sonnen. His legendary title run came to an end at UFC 162, when the All-American Chris Weidman landed a knockout blow in the second round. To make matters worse, the Spider suffered a gruesome leg injury when the two men met for the second time at UFC 168. Given the severity of the injury, combined with the fact that Silva was 38 when he fought Weidman the first time, it's not all that surprising that Silva's skills diminished following their rivalry. To be fair, Silva still looked competitive against top-tier fighters even well into his 40s. That being said, the pound-for-pound great is sporting a less than stellar 1-5-1 record since UFC 162, and unfortunately looks like a shell of his former self. Number 1. BJ Penn. BJ Penn is a Hall of Famer who is known for being only the second fighter in UFC history to hold championships in 2 different weight classes. The Hawaiian Jiu-Jitsu ace holds notable victories over some of the sport's biggest names. However, seemingly out of nowhere, Penn's fighting career began what would turn out to be a very lengthy decline. This following his first loss to Frankie Edgar back in 2010. The initial Edgar fight wasn't a particularly brutal affair, especially when compared to some of the previous contests we've discussed, but for whatever reason, following the fight, the prodigy never recaptured the magic that made him a 2-division champ. In fact, when he was ultimately released from the UFC last September due to his conduct, Penn was in the midst of a 7-fight losing streak, the longest such streak in the promotion's history. That streak included losses to the likes of Nick Diaz, Rory McDonald, Yair Rodriguez and Clay Guida. BJ Penn will always be regarded as a legend of the sport, but his career undoubtedly took one of the worst downturns in MMA history. As always, if you guys enjoyed this video, then please be sure to let me know by leaving a like and subscribing to our channel. Apart from that, thanks so much for watching guys, and we'll see you on the next video.